start late, but we started 2 minutes late. Literally, right as I was about to go live, I was about to set up the live stream. We were about, hello Ray and hello Katie. Right as we were about to go live, the stream was all choppy, and I couldn't figure out why. I rebooted my MacBook, which hasn't been rebooted in 5 months, and I kid you not, it rebooted and gave me a notification that it failed to start the operating system. But it was a fluke, and the operating system was fine, and the MacBook was fine. So here we are. I've had quite a day, my friends. How are you all doing? I also want to thank Craig Cohen for being our first donor of the evening. He's been very adamantly claiming that title. But, Craig right there. Good evening, Henrik, Henwolf, and Chicano. Rebecca Randolph, yay indeed. Keith Thomas said, poofed amateurs. Jeff McClellan said, I was getting worried. You're one of the most prompt people I know. Believe me, I know. But we made it, my friends, we made it. We are here again on a Wednesday night, ready to get a little spooky, because even though many places are starting to open up, we still are mostly stuck at home. And I've got a very enjoyable book to continue reading with you all, which is, of course, more scary stories for sleepovers. So what say we jump into this book? We all pretend I wasn't 2 minutes late and pardon my French, spitting bricks. And we'll just jump into the story, and I'll chat with you guys some more afterward. And, remember, sharing is scaring, so please hit that share button. Let people know you're hanging out tonight, listening to scary stories. And if you feel like leaving a tip, they are appreciated, but not required. And they are super, super appreciated, by the way. So anyway, let's start with the first story, and then I'll hang out with you guys a little bit more in the chat. Rebecca Randolph said, best part of my week. Thank you. Tony Mars said, yeah, Wednesday night. Yeah. And Diana Adler said, grr, technology. Hey, technology's usually very good to me. Tonight was just a little bit, woof. So here we go. Let's start the scares. This story is called Wish Fulfillment. Hopefully it's not about shipping items from Wish.com. Greg was the only 5th grade student who didn't like his teacher, Mrs. Reed. But then, Greg didn't seem to really like anyone. He thought her classes were too boring and didn't hesitate to mention that to anyone who would listen. Even when the teacher arranged special events, such as a visit by a real astronaut during a class on the solar system, Greg criticized the idea. Now that the mummy and certain belongings of the great Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun were on tour, the class was scheduled to go on a field trip to the local Natural History Museum. All of the students were excited about the trip. Well, almost all. Greg started complaining as soon as the class began to board the bus that would take them into town. This is dumb, he grumbled to Maria, the girl unfortunate enough to sit next to him. Who wants to see an old dead guy? Maria scowled. I do. King Tut was one of the most famous people who ever lived. When he was our age, he ruled an entire country. I think this is exciting. Greg waved his hand. That's not such a big deal. When I grow up, I'm going to be famous too. Oh yeah? Benny Taylor twisted in his seat to look back at Greg. What are you going to do to become famous? Talk everyone to death? I've got a plan, Greg lied. I haven't absolutely decided yet, but there are a lot of things I could do. Maybe I'll be a race car driver. He looked at his companions to see if they were impressed. No one was. Not just any old race car driver, Greg continued. One of those daredevils like that guy that jumped over the Grand Canyon. Nobody ever jumped over the Grand Canyon, Benny snorted. Greg crossed his arms and smiled smugly. Then I'll be the first one. You'll see, someday everyone will know who I am. Benny and Maria both laughed as the rumbling of the bus engine grew louder and the vehicle carefully turned out of the parking lot and onto the main road. Greg might not be very enthusiastic about visiting the museum, but he was pleased to miss a day of school. He really didn't see the point of learning history and geography. Those kids that work so hard and always turn in homework and stuff are dumb. There's an easier way, Greg thought to himself. The drive to the city took less than an hour. During that time, Mrs. Reed explained to the children that the museum was fairly large, so it was important that they all stick together. She informed them of the rules that they would be expected to follow, such as being quiet as possible and not touching any of the objects. Finally, she passed out a map of the museum to each student. The room that held the Egyptian exhibit was marked with a large X. Soon, the yellow school bus pulled slowly into the parking lot in front of the city museum. Talking and laughing, the children filled out the bus and gathered at the entrance to the building. Near the door, a beautiful fountain spouted a glistening stream of water into the air. The morning sun created a breathtaking rainbow that quivered in the delicate spray. Greg barely noticed it. He simply whined about how hot it was standing in the sun. "When are they going to let us inside?" he griped. Once inside the huge air-conditioned lobby, he continued to protest. "This is going to take forever. When are we supposed to stop for lunch? This is so boring." Finally, Maria had had enough. "Look, Greg," she said angrily, "if you're going to do nothing but complain, you're going to ruin it for everyone else. Why don't you just keep your comments to yourself?" She walked off to join the rest of the group. Greg watched her go. He hated it when someone told him to be quiet. "Go ahead, jerk. I didn't want to come anyway." The other students turned a corner, and Greg slowed down enough to find himself alone. He had decided to explore on his own when Mrs. Reed peeked back around the corner. "Gregory, please stay with us. I don't want to have to worry about you." Grudgingly, Greg trailed along as the group passed by a display of early American Indian art. As he reached out to feel a large woven basket, a nearby guard spoke up. "Please don't touch that, son. It's very old." "So what?" Greg responded and looked defiantly into the man's eyes. The guard was obviously irritated with Greg's lack of respect. "Why don't you stay with your teacher, kid? You might get into trouble roaming around on your own. And don't touch anything." Greg was about to say something in return, but thought better of it. He sauntered away, unsure which direction his group had gone. He turned back to ask the guard, but found himself completely alone. The marbled hall was curiously quiet. Dark-toned paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. From every direction, painted eyes stared at him. Greg could feel their gaze, and it made him uneasy. He headed toward the far end of the hall. Moments later, he found himself before a grand archway marked "The Tools of Ancient Magic." Carefully, he pulled the crumpled map of the museum from his pocket to see how far he was from the Egyptian room. Oddly, the Tools of Ancient Magic exhibit did not appear on the map. Still, it sounded a lot more interesting than hanging around gaping at the moldy old mummy. So Greg stepped through the arch and found himself in a spacious room. The light was mainly provided by small spotlights over the displays. Against each wall was a tall glass case presenting unusual objects made of wood, rock, or bone and decorated with beads, feathers, and shells. One sign identified a large carved bone as an object for casting out evil spirits that caused mental illness. A small crystal was labeled as a charm that would protect the wearer from poison. But Greg was drawn to a lone exhibit spotlighted in the center of the room. It was a huge, rough rock at least 10 feet tall. Some long-forgotten person had carved it to look like a human face with long earlobes and a jutting jaw. The rock was surrounded by velvet ropes. A sign stood nearby requesting the visitors not touch the display. For a moment, Greg stood in front of the sign. Then he smiled and reached out to run his fingertips over the stone. It was surprisingly warm and soft, almost like human flesh. He trailed his fingers along the side of the wide, silent mouth. "Ouch!" he cried as he snatched his hand back from the rock. Something sharp had pricked his finger. A tiny drop of blood glistened at the corner of the statue's lip. Looking around to be sure he was alone, Greg reached out to rub the drop away, but he only caused it to smear. He felt the stone grow warmer, and the air around him seemed to hum. Greg's heart raced. He quickly whirled and dashed for the door, but it was gone. Turning completely around, he saw that there was no exit, just 4 smooth, solid walls. He threw himself against the place where the door had been, but it didn't budge. Hey, what's going on here?" The terrified boy pounded at the wall with his closed fist. "What do you want?" a deep voice echoed behind him. Greg froze fearfully. He turned to see a shadowy figure standing near the statue. "I asked you, what do you want?" the voice repeated. "Why did you call me?" I didn't call you," Greg stammered. The dark bloodstain glittered on the stone. "You did." "I'm sorry," Greg was trembling. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to get out." Let's get it over with, the figure interrupted. It's bad enough that I must use my powers for the benefit of worthless humans. I don't need to listen to your meaningless babble as well. As frightened as he was, Greg bristled at the insult. Who's worthless? Who do you think you are? I know precisely who I am, the being answered. I am a genie of the most ancient realm. Greg's amazement and curiosity overpowered his fear. A genie? You mean like from a bottle? The genie seemed very annoyed. Something like that. Now, what do you want? You have to grant wishes, don't you? Greg's terror had turned to pleasure. This was it. He had always known something like this was going to happen to him. The genie sneered. It seems you have done a little reading. I'm overwhelmed by this display of intelligence. Greg was losing his temper. I wish you would stop being so mean and just give me an answer. The light dimmed. For a second, the surroundings grew hazy, then became clear. Yes, the genie said smugly, I must grant you 3 wishes. 1 down, 2 to go. It snickered. But be careful. Fortune sees to it that no one gets any more than they deserve. You tricked me out of 1 wish, Greg frowned. But I'm too smart for you. I know exactly what I want, and now you have to grant my wishes. He stood proudly with his hands on his hips. I want to be the richest boy who ever lived, and I want to be famous, one of the most famous people in the world. Once again, the room dimmed, and the details swirled into an indistinct pool of color and shadow. When things became clear again, Greg was lying on his back. All of his classmates were gathered around him in awe. Maria leaned in close. He heard her whisper, Wow. Benny stared steadily into his eyes. Cool. Greg felt triumphant. He tried to open his mouth to shout, I told you so, but nothing happened. Struggling to sit up, he realized that his body wouldn't respond. The only thing he could feel at all was a deep, penetrating cold, the cold of the grave. His nostrils were filled with the smell of countless centuries of decay. Mrs. Reed leaned over Greg. She was smiling. Yes, children, the boy king was the richest of the pharaohs. During his short life, he was probably one of the most important people on earth. You might say he was the richest, most famous boy who ever lived. Ah! Oh, that was good. That got me goosebumped. That got me goosebumped, kids. Oh, that got me. Let's see what you guys are talking about in here. Oh, man, what a what a start to the show. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Rob Fields, for your tip. I very much appreciate it. And thank you, Shane Migliavaca, for your awesome tip. Thank you guys so much. You guys have been awesomely generous the entire time I've been running this live stream, and I really appreciate it. Remember, sharing is scaring. So let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. Shane Migliavaca said, well, Greg's gonna die. Ray Cersei said, Greg is whiny. Yeah. Diane said, yup, definitely dead meat. Rob said, Greg's entitled. Shane Migliavaca said, beating a child is wrong, but Greg might be the exception. Ray Cersei said, The Rock will eat Greg. Close, unless you're talking about Rocky Johnson. Tony Marr, Wish.com fulfillment is way scarier. Rebecca Randolph, that was awesome. I agree. Rob Field said, yep, he was entitled. And then Tony said, suck it, Greg. You guys are vicious. Now, for those of you who have joined us almost every week or every single week, we've done 8 of these. This is the 8th one. We've read through almost 4 total books from the Scary Stories for Sleepovers book series, and we've been reading them in random order to some extent. We read the 3rd one, then the 2nd one. I believe this is the 3rd or 4th one. I can't remember for sure. But we read the 8th and 9th ones were very different. But in the early versions of Scary Stories for Sleepovers, there's almost always a bratty kid who's gonna get his comeuppance. And let that be a lesson to you. Honestly, I love that part of these books because it makes sense. You know, these are scary stories to tell at sleepovers, so why wouldn't they star kids who are being crummy, getting bad things happen, having bad things happen to them? I mean, what more could be scary to kids I mean, they don't even know what taxes really are yet. So, I mean, that's pretty much the thing that's going to scare them, right? I just spilled water all over my lap. Anyway, um, so Rob Field said, it's been a while, but I finally got to be off on a Wednesday night. That means I can be around the fire with the rest of you. You bet. Pat Kleberg said, first visit to the campfire. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us, Pat. Make sure if you get a chance, hit the share button and let people know what you're doing, that you're hanging out with a group of people, talking some smack, listening to some scary stories, and just, honestly, we're just embracing what it is to be kids. That's what this is about, and that's why I've been so into doing it, and why I've made it a point to do it every single week. And you know, it all started, obviously, when lockdown started. The first episode was on April 1st, but since then, you know, I could have done other things on my Wednesday nights, but I enjoy this so much. I enjoy acting like a bunch of goofy kids with you guys. And some of you are even hanging out with your own kids, watching and listening, and that's awesome. So, what say, my friends? We go to another story. All right. Let's see what this one is. Okay. This one is called The Box. Ready or not, here I come. Tad uncovered his eyes and looked around. In one direction, he could see a carpet of short, spiky sawgrass that seemed to roll on for miles. Sunlight glinted off the standing water in which the grass grew. On another side, tall, spindly cypress trees rose from soggy flatlands dotted with shallow pools. Tad was standing in the cool shade of a thick stand of pine and live oak. At first glance, he seemed to be alone, but he knew they were all there. Sorry, Henwolf walked into the light and startled me. Threw me off a little bit. His two little sisters would be the easiest to find. They never went very far into the swamp. And they always giggled. He saw a flash of red off to his left. He turned in that direction, treading cautiously. His dad had told him that's how Indians moved. The only Indians Tad ever saw were those selling souvenirs at the Tommy Tommy Trail. But he loved Indian lore and read everything he could about the first people who lived in the swamp. His father knew lots of Indians. He worked for the Central and Southern Florida Food Control District and probably knew more things about this land than anybody. A twig snapped a few feet away. Tad eased up to a half-rotten, moss-covered log and leaned over it. Two small girls were crouching behind it, heads close together, hands across their mouths, stifling laughter. "I see you!" he whooped, and the girls squealed and ran off in the direction of home base. It was no contest. He tagged them easily and declared them slaves. They would have to wait there while he searched for Dave and Scooch. Tad headed out into the swamp. There were probably a few snakes around and maybe even a gator or two, but it was pretty safe and easy to get around since much of the swamp had dried up. In the fall, the ground he was walking on would be knee-deep in mucky water. Because of the danger, he wasn't allowed to play out there then. An Indian legend claimed that strange spirits lived in this part of the swamp. Tad had seen pictures of ancient rock carvings and paintings from the area that showed scenes of odd, green-eyed, long-faced creatures falling to the earth from the stars. Tad's mom said there were enough hazards out there without worrying about ghostly aliens. A rustling noise caught Tad's attention. He stood, perfectly still. The sound was coming from a pile of brown leaves fanned around the base of a palmetto tree. Slowly, he crouched down to pick up a small stone. Aiming carefully, he threw it. A few dried leaves crackled like tissue paper, and a long, mustard-colored lizard broke cover. Tad pounced, grabbing it by its neck. The little creature squirmed in his hand. That was when he heard Dave calling his name. He'd forgotten all about the game. He gently released his captive and watched it scurry to safety. "I'm over here!" Tad yelled, cupping his hands around his mouth. A moment later, two boys tumbled into the clearing. They were panting hard and both tried to speak at once. Dave finally forced the words out between gasps. We found something. Out there. You gotta come see." Scooch just nodded as he tried to untangle his shoelaces. Tad figured this must be really important. What is it, a body? Indians? Better, Dave said. He leaned in and whispered, "It's a secret passage." "Come on, are you kidding? Way out here? I swear!" Dave raised his left hand. He wasn't too bright and would have to stay back in the 5th grade at Clewiston Elementary this fall, but when he vowed something was true, nobody questioned it. "Okay," Tad grinned. "Let's go." The sun was directly overhead when the trio reached a wide hammock covered with cypress and scrub pine. Even in the brightness of day, dark shadows huddled under the trees, shadows from which unseen eyes could track the boys' progress deeper into the swamp. Scooch pointed out some puma tracks leading off into the dense undergrowth. None of them had ever actually seen a wild puma before, but at night, safe in their beds, they'd all heard the snarls of the hunting cat. Before long, they came across the remains of an unlucky armadillo. "I don't like this place. I think we're too far out," Scooch murmured, eyeing the body and looking around. "Maybe we should forget it." "Nah, don't worry, that cat's long gone." Tad tossed a clod of dirt at the armadillo. A cloud of flies rose, then settled again. "Come on, it's over here," Dave said as they skirted the carcass. He led the way up a wide mound. It was only a few feet higher than the surrounding area, but that would be enough to keep the patch of land above the water level when the rain came. Tad poked around in the thatch with his foot. "There's nothing up here," he huffed. Suddenly, he felt himself falling. His legs slipped through the tangle up to his thigh. There was nothing but open space under his foot. He scooted back to solid ground. "Whoa! What is it?" Proudly, Dave pulled at the matted vines. "I did the same thing. That's how we found it. Look." A large clump ripped free. Tad stretched out on his belly and gazed down into the black, gaping hole. The cold, damp air stung his nostrils. Something was down there. Something very old. "Want to go down?" Dave poked at him. "I have my pen light." "We don't know what's there, Dave. Besides, there's no way to get down." Tad desperately wanted to investigate the opening, but he knew that the swamp held many surprises and exploration could be dangerous unless they were properly prepared. See, there are some kind of stairs." Dave shined his light on crude stone steps descending into the blackness. "What about the girls? I left them alone. They don't know where we are," Tad said feebly. He knew he was cornered. "They'll be okay. They'll get bored waiting and probably go home." "All right, but leave Scooch up here to stand guard in case we need help." Against his better judgment, Tad agreed. Dave nodded and Scooch sighed with relief. The two boys lowered themselves into the opening. Dave went first with the flashlight. It was difficult to keep their footing on the damp, slimy steps. "Hey, Scooch!" Dave yelled up. "Try pulling away some more vines!" Dried leaves, grass, and small twigs showered down on them as the boy tugged at the thatch above their heads. With a crackling sound, a large knot of it gave way and sunlight streamed into the pit. Their surroundings took shape around them. The passage was about 6 feet across, and the steps, which were carved directly from the stone, curved about 15 feet toward a small opening in the opposite wall. Whatever this was, it had been here for hundreds of years, and the swamp seemed to be trying to reclaim it. The walls were green with mold, and moisture was seeping in on all sides. "I wonder why this doesn't dry up like everything else," Dave whispered. "It's probably below the waterline. Limestone's real porous." Dave furrowed his brow at Tad. "How'd you know that?" "My dad told me. Sometimes he takes me out on field trips, as he calls them. We do experiments and stuff. This whole place is nothing but sand, mud, and limestone." Finally, they stood before the opening at the base of the steps. Dave shined the flashlight inside the passageway, but it didn't do much good. "Are you with me?" Tad tried to keep his voice steady, but he had an uncomfortable feeling. He wanted to turn and get away from that place as quickly as possible, but his curiosity was stronger. "Sure," he said. "Let's go." They ducked under the arch and found themselves in a small, shallow cave that at first appeared to be empty. "Be careful," Tad cautioned. "There might be water moccasins." Dave nodded and moved on, his sneakers making squishing noises in the foul-smelling slime. He swept the light in back and forth motion across the floor. "Dad, look at that!" A few feet away, a massive rectangle of stone rose out from the reeking muck. It was very wide, nearly shoulder height, and about 7 feet long. It appeared to be topped with an immense slab of solid rock. The sides were deeply carved with intricate figures and designs, some familiar, most not. "This is an Indian place," Tad murmured. "It looks like an altar or something." "You mean for sacrifices? Or a tomb? I don't know." "Look!" Dave pointed his tiny light at a wide depression in the rock. Nestled in it was a smooth grayish box, about the size of a shoebox. It was wreathed with shells and stones. "What is it?" Tad tiptoed closer. "I don't know for sure. It looks like it's made out of some kind of metal. It sure isn't something that the Indians made. But those are strings of Rutu shells around it. The Seminoles thought they were magic and used them to trap their enemies in one place." "You mean the Indians trapped something in there? Like an animal or something?" Dave backed up a step or two. "How did they know it wouldn't get out?" "The legend goes that the shells contain the spirits of dead ancestors. The spirits are responsible for keeping the enemy in place, but they can do that only as long as the string of shells are unbroken. Whoever put this here sure used a lot of them." He cast a sidelong glance at his friend. "They must have been terribly afraid of whatever was in that box. They used some powerful medicine to keep it there." "Let's take it," Dave breathed. Tad could feel his body shaking. He wanted to do just as Dave suggested, but somewhere deep down inside, some primeval fear gnawed at him. "We really shouldn't move it." "Come on, you don't really believe in all that magic junk," Dave said, even though he was too afraid to pick up the box himself. He looked at Tad and said slyly, "I bet your dad would be real proud of you for finding this." It was true. Tad knew this was the sort of thing his father had been searching for all those field trips. Dave pushed him forward. "Go on, take it." Trembling with fear and anticipation, Tad reached out and gripped the box. But then, when he tried to lift it, it seemed glued to the spot. Closing his eyes, he tugged harder. Abruptly, the rotted strings that held the Rutu shells gave way, and he stumbled backwards. Something unseen brushed against his foot, then slithered away in the ooze. A bone-chilling wind swirled through the cave. Suddenly, it seemed as if 1,000 voices were whispering, a single warning. A warning that Tad sensed, rather than heard. "No, don't free them." As impossible as it seemed, it felt as if hundreds of phantom hands were tugging at his fingers and grasping helplessly at the box. In the darkness, he saw that the container was beginning to glow. It felt slightly warm in his hands. In terror, Tad lurched forward to return the frightening object to its resting place. But he knew it was too late. The ancient magic that had confined it had been undone. The Rutu shells crumbled into dust, and the huge stone slab began to slide away, revealing that the massive stone beneath was hollow. Inside, there were what appeared to be 2 large, coffin-like cylinders. They were made of some strange glassy material and filled with swirling, unearthly greenish gas. Rooted to the spot, the boys watched with dread as a seam along each cylinder popped open, and the tops raised slowly in a cloud of medicinal-smelling gas. The penlight slipped from Dave's grasp and sank in the muddy puddle on the floor. Still, an eerie glow from the now open stone illuminated the cave as slowly, ponderously, a silver-suited figure rose from each cylinder, raising what looked like bizarre laser weapons. The beings turned to look directly at the boys. They had long faces and large, emerald green, cat-like eyes. One of the creatures lifted its hand toward Tad and bared its sharp, ragged teeth in some sort of grin. Although it didn't actually speak, Tad understood it. "The box," it seemed to order. "Give me the box." As if waking from a trance, Tad turned and careened, slipping and sliding up the steps, out of the hole and back into the sunshine with Dave at his heels. Scotch was at his side, babbling. What did you guys see down there? What did you find? What is it? Run! Get out of here, Tad screamed. They're right behind us! Dave was about halfway out of the pit when a green flash of light cracked up from below and enveloped him. For one moment he looked down at himself with a surprised expression, then at his friends. The next moment there was a sizzling sound, and Dave was gone. The smell of charred flesh filled the air. The beings appeared at the opening and leveled their weapons at two remaining boys. "Let's go," Tad yelled. Dropping the box, he sprinted farther into the swamp. A bolt of green light hit the ground to his right. A large patch of vegetation glittered, then disappeared. Behind him, he heard Scooch shriek, followed by that hideous sizzling sound. Staggering, he regained his balance and raced deeper and deeper into the swamp. Tad didn't think about the snakes or the gators or the approaching night. He pushed everything from his mind but the thought of escape. He didn't even realize that he was no longer being followed. At the opening of their former tomb, one of the creatures knelt, carefully lifted the metal box, and opened it. Inside was a maze of tiny wires and a keyboard covered with peculiar symbols. As he held it, a light began to speed along the tubes and a low humming sound vibrated the box. He fingered a few keys, then motioned to his comrade, who was watching Tad disappear into the endless sweep of sawgrass. "Let him go. I've sent our position. It won't do him any good to run. Besides, we should be grateful. Because of his primitive curiosity, we have finally gained our freedom. We underestimated the Earthlings last time and allowed ourselves to be captured while we were in our energy pods. This time, we'll take no chances." Beyond the orbit of Pluto, the sleek star cruiser was nearing its destination when they first picked up the signal. "Captain, we're picking up extreme emergency signals from Solar G3 in this system." The captain blinked his large, emerald green cat-like eyes. "Do we have a team there?" "Yes, sir. They were stationed 700 planetary years past." "That's a world of very primitive civilizations. Our team should have taken over by now. Something must have gone very wrong. Arm all support crafts. Seal the quadrant. Set hyperlight speed. We're going in. Full force." Far away, Tad collapsed, exhausted, across an outcrop of rock. He rubbed his scraped and bleeding knees. It seemed as if he had been running for hours. In the distance, he heard the growl of a hunting puma. "It'll be okay," he tried to convince himself. "I'll circle back tomorrow and warn my dad. He'll know what to do." There was nowhere he could go until morning, so Tad rolled on his back and took comfort in watching the stars. He fell asleep without noticing the dozens of points of light in the night sky that seemed to be growing larger and coming closer and closer. Man, that went full sci-fi at the end. That was pretty cool. I like that one. What'd you guys think? Let's see what you guys are saying. Thank you so much, Ray Cersei. She sent me a tip on Venmo. She said, "Swamp creature." Kind of, but not, but kind of. So let's see what you guys are saying in the chat. Oh boy, you guys are having fun. All right. Jeffrey Linder said, "It's not dark enough outside. Much easier if I put the fire on the TV with the volume down. I should have grabbed more crickets for my beardy tank for that extra campfire cricket. For the extra campfire crickets. They would amplify with Henrik's cricket sound, get extra creepy." That's some ambience right there. Keith Tomlin said, "First mistake, trusting someone named Dave." That's fair. Michelle Antisocial said, "If this were my story, they would all get leprosy from that armadillo." Shane Migliavacca said, "Betty White is down there." Ray Cersei said, "Swampo creature." So I guess you guys enjoyed that one. I definitely did. Please do, as I've mentioned before, sharing is caring and sharing is scaring. So I messed that up. Isn't that terrible? So make sure to share the event, or not the event, but the live video. Sorry, I'm trying to do like 8 things at once. There we go. I'm opening up the chat again. Make sure to share it around so people can join us. Keith Tomlin said, "Oh wait, let's see." Dave Denoyer said, don't ever listen to Dave's. No, really, though. Tony Marr said, someone really wants to keep this box here. Let's take it. Rob Fields commented a meme from Seven that said, what's in the box? Ray Cersei said, spooky. Poor Dave. Keith Tomlin said, any story where a Dave dies first is a good story in my book. Ray Cersei said, swamp aliens. And Keith Tomlin said, are those predators? And you know, he's not really wrong. They kind of were. So you guys are having a good time? I am. My voice is already being, just a little bit of a butt, but it's not too bad. So I'm feeling pretty good. And I want to thank you guys again for being so generous with your tips. I really do appreciate it. I bought this special spray for my throat. It's specifically meant for people who are performing to help them keep from getting hoarse. Man, that tastes awful. But yeah, that was a pretty fun one. I wasn't expecting the sci-fi bent. These stories never cease to surprise. Even if you've figured out, most of the formula. Here's a kid, he's going to do something bad's going to happen to him. Man, how do you get there? You really never know. So let's see what we got next. Did I drop the book? No, here it is. All right, uh-oh. I feel like one of you guys in here has an affinity for killer plants. I don't know why, but I seem to recall that. It sounds like, based on the title, this might be your lucky night. Because this next story is called Green Thumb. Where are you going, young lady? Mrs. Guerrero held up her hand as Leah headed for the door. I'm going with Dad. They're judging the entries for the tomato growing contest today. I want to get a look at the competition, so he's going to drive me to the fairgrounds early. Her mother shook her head. You know very well that you are going to win that contest just like you have for the past 3 years. Hope so. The girl raced to the kitchen door and grabbed a home-baked muffin as she sped by. It was still warm from the oven. Leah scrambled into the passenger seat of her dad's red pickup. All set? He grinned. Leah nodded, her mouth full of food. After using that special soil mixture you've worked up, your tomatoes this year are better than ever. Her father pulled the truck out of the driveway and onto a narrow dirt road that led to the highway. Leah agreed. It really worked well, but I think I've come up with a few things that'll make the plants grow even bigger and faster. I've added them to the old compost pit over behind the stone wall at the far side of the house. Is that okay? I don't see why not. No one ever goes back there, Mr. Guerrero said as he turned the pickup onto the main highway. The following morning, Leah was up bright and early. First, she put out a bowl of milk for Jake, her orange and white striped kitten. Then she proudly added her new blue ribbon to the others displayed in a glass cabinet in the living room. Later, she and her mom cleared a large patch near the barn of pumpkins. Leah spread a thick layer of her newest soil mixture over the area and worked it in thoroughly with a hoe. After lunch, she rode her bike to the store to pick up some things for her mom. Hi, Leah. Mr. Warden, the grocer, looked up as she came in. Your order's ready. I have something for you. He handed her a magazine. This came in a pack of seed catalogs. It was the only one, so I think it was a mistake. Anyway, it's about exotic plants. You might find something special in it for your garden. Gee, thanks, Mr. Warden. Leah slipped the gift into her grocery sack. Then, when she got home, she curled up on her favorite window seat with the magazine. Jake padded gently along the sill and stretched out in the sun behind her. A small ad on the back page caught her attention. What's this? She said to herself. The kitten looked up as if waiting for her to say something more. Guaranteed to amaze, it read, the world's most unusual vine, only for the most accomplished of gardeners. Leah was intrigued and challenged. She filled out the little coupon provided and posted her order that very day. Less than 1 week later, a small box addressed to Leah simply marked Seeds arrived in the mail. She quickly opened it, ripped the top from the packet inside, and tapped a few light, dainty red seeds out into her hand. What are they? She asked out loud. The instructions on the packet just said to sow them near the surface and fertilize with bone meal. Leah got permission from her mom to plant the unusual seeds in a part of the area they had cleared for the pumpkin patch. Within 2 days, the first pole shoots showed themselves above the rich soil. Within a week, the plant was several inches high. Wow, Jake, can you believe this? Leah crouched down beside the young plant and rubbed one of its bright green leaves. Long, slender tendrils curled out from the stem. I've never seen anything grow like this. Not this fast. Except maybe you. Jake wasn't particularly interested. He had discovered a small hole in the ground and was busily trying to excavate whatever had made it. Leah straightened up and looked at her chubby kitten. He turned his attention to a cricket, slapping at it with his paws. One well-placed blow stunned the insect. Good boy. Just you keep trying. I hope you turn out to be a natural ratter. You'll have plenty to keep you busy if you do. She headed for the house, then stopped short. Had she heard a soft sigh? It must have been the wind, she said to herself. Behind her, a thread-like plant tendril snaked out and wrapped tightly around the motionless cricket. Jake laid his ears back, bared his teeth, and hissed as the slender stalk dragged the tiny body into the soil. During the summer, Leah usually slept with her window open. She liked to fall asleep listening to the sounds of the night. One evening, just as she was drifting off, she heard a strange but familiar sound. Opening her eyes wide, she listened carefully. It was a soft, wistful sigh, almost a moan. Where had she heard it before? Rising quietly, she crossed to the open window and tried to peer into the dark. A sharp squeal pierced the night. Then another. Both came from the garden. Once again, everything was still. It sounds like rats, she said under her breath. Jake must be on the prowl. From then on, Leah heard the fearful squeals every night. Each day she tended her peculiar plant, which seemed to grow more lush by the hour. The barn wall was nearly covered with long, twinning tendrils. Trumpet-shaped, blood-red flowers covered much of it, and she counted 8 long, gnarly seed pods hanging from the highest vines. One morning she decided to add more of the treated miracle soil from her compost pit around the plant's roots. Leah's mind was not on her work, however, as she dug her hands into the ground. She was worried about Jake. He hadn't shown up for breakfast. Leah had already planned to search for him when she felt a slight sting. Yanking her hands from the thick, dark brown earth, she watched as a droplet of blood formed at the tip of one of her fingers. I should have been wearing gloves, she mumbled, wondering what might have caused the small cut. Looking down, she noticed that the end of a single root protruded just above the soil. The pale greenish point was smeared with a tiny bit of blood. Leah touched it lightly. It was sharp. Suddenly the root seemed to quiver, and it moved slightly toward the blood on her finger. She drew back her hand and jumped up. I think I've been working in the sun too long. I'm letting my imagination play tricks on me, she reasoned. That treated soil of yours certainly speeds up growth, her mom commented over dinner that night. I used just a little in my azaleas, and I could swear they shot up a foot in less than a week. I can't imagine what an entire potful would do. It's certainly done wonders for your new plant, too. I don't think I've ever seen such a healthy vine. Thanks, Leah responded, but she was still a little troubled. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something evil about the strange vine. Her dad added, I think our little Jake deserves a round of applause, too. He's turned out to be quite a ratter. I haven't laid eyes on a single rat in the barn for more than a week. By the way, where is he? I don't know, Dad. I haven't seen him since yesterday. I looked for him all afternoon, Leah said worriedly. That's odd, her father mused. Come to think of it, a lot of pets have been reported missing lately. Liz Bernstein told me her boy's pet goat wandered off a couple of days ago, and they haven't seen it since. Her mom patted Leah's hand. I'm sure he'll be all right. Dear, cats can take care of themselves. He'll be back. I hope so, Leah murmured. When Jake didn't show up the next morning for breakfast, Leah was certain that something was wrong. She decided to look for him once again in the barn. They had no livestock, so the barn was used primarily for storage. It was a perfect hiding place for rodents, and thus an ideal hunting ground for a clever cat. The old wooden door screeched as she entered the cool, dark building. The only other sound was that of her own footsteps on the hard-packed earth. "Here, Jake. Where are you, boy?" There was no response. Her dad was right. There were no rats anywhere. In fact, there seemed to be no insects either. Nothing living except... Scanning the base of the wall, she saw dozens of curling green tendrils growing in through the cracks. In a darkened corner, one strand was wrapped so tightly around something that she couldn't make out what it was. She walked to the spot and nudged the vine with her foot. The limp tail of a very dead rat protruded from within the coil. Leah felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. There, near the body, was Jake's empty blue collar. She edged out of the barn and backed into the garden. As she moved near the vine, she felt something lightly touch her leg. Jake? Lifting back a wide leaf, she was horrified to see a thick plant tendril shoot out and twine around her leg, tightening all the while. "Dad! Dad!" she screamed with all her might. In no time, her parents were beside her. "It's attacking me! Get it off! Get it off!" Her father quickly sliced through the stem with a pocket knife. "Leah, what happened? Calm down." "The plant," she sobbed. "It's the reason there are no rats. It got Jake too. I know it." Her mother stroked her hair. "That's not possible, dear. It's only a plant. You just got tangled in it somehow. But if it worries you, we'll dig it up. And burn it? If that'll make you feel better." Within the hour, Mr. Guerrero had unearthed the plant. When he came into the house, he smelled slightly of smoke. "Did you burn it, Dad?" "Yes, honey. I burned every leaf, every flower, and all of those weird seed pods." He decided it was best not to tell Leah about the collection of small bones he had uncovered at its roots. That night, Leah lay awake in her room, straining to hear the dreaded sound. Her parents had already gone to bed when she heard it, but it was not where she expected. The noise came not from the garden near the barn, but from the far side of the house, beyond the stone wall about 30 yards away, the area where she had so carefully tended her large pit of treated soil. "Jake?" She sat up. "Maybe he really is okay. Maybe he just ran away and now he's come home," she reasoned. Slipping on her pair of slippers, Leah crept downstairs to the kitchen. She reached for the flashlight that hung near the door and stepped outside. It was a dark, moonless night. She pointed the flashlight toward the ground to light her path. All the while she softly called, "Here, kitty. Here, Jake. Come on, boy." Pebbles scattered as Leah climbed over the crumbling stone wall on the far side of the house. A gentle sound, barely more than a moan, made her freeze in her tracks. Stunned, she lifted the flashlight. Its beam illuminated a huge vine that was part of a gigantic plant. It grew directly from the deep pit of special soil and covered the entire wall. Before Leah could open her mouth to scream, a slim tendril slid around her throat. Its leaves covered her face. The flashlight clattered to the ground. The flashlight's beam of light slowly faded as dawn approached. A gentle breeze rustled the strong, healthy vine growing in the shadows. At its crown, a long, gnarly seed pod suddenly split open, just as one had a few days before on the parent plant. The breeze lifted the small red seeds inside the pot and carried them aloft, scattering them in every direction. Oh man, I like that one. Okay, let's see what you guys are saying. Eventually. Let's see. Real quick, I want to say thank you so much, Keith Tomlin, for your tip. I really do appreciate it. His comment was just the tip. Let's see. All right. Sorry about that. It was loading weird. Does this story end with Donald Sutherland pointing at her and wailing? That's funny. That was Keith Tomlin. Shane Migliavacca said, "Cat does wonders for evil plants." Ooh, that poor cat. Well, you know. Shane Migliavacca said, "It's getting Evil Dead around here." Heather Fairchild said, all these killer plants is exactly why I don't garden. Pro tip. Man, that's gross. It does help, though. But yeah, thank you again, Keith, for the tip. And thank you guys for everybody who's hitting share. Please do share, because I'm going to say it again, sharing is scaring, because I made that up, and I'm very proud of it. My voice is being a little tricky. We'll see how long it can hold up. Usually we go till about 10 o'clock. We should be able to at least get, close to that, get at least a few more stories out. So let's see. The chat seems pretty calm, so guess we'll go to the next one. All right. This next story is called Nightmare. Todd was in a hurry. He planned to meet his friends Paula and Charles at Levy's drugstore after school. Today was delivery day for new magazines, and he was anxious to get a copy of the latest Monster Madness. It was a double issue and included the details for a drawing contest that Todd wanted to enter. Todd was a true and faithful fan of fright. Frankenstein, Dracula, the werewolf, the creature from the Black Lagoon. Todd knew all of the stories in complete detail. Ghost stories were good, and he wouldn't turn up his nose at an alien adventure, but tales of monsters were his favorite. The scarier and more gruesome they were, the better. His notebook was filled with drawings of sharp-fanged, drooling beasts stalking through darkened streets, searching for unsuspecting victims. By the time he arrived at Levy's, his friends were already perched on the bench outside the store. Charles was working the monster maze, a feature that always appeared at the end of the magazine. Paula, sipping a soda, was deeply engrossed in a story. Todd quietly leaned his bike on its kickstand and crept up behind his friends. "Yeah!" he roared. Both kids jumped. Paula dropped the can, and a small fizzy brown puddle quickly formed on the sidewalk. "Geez, Todd, you scared me to death." "I'm sorry," he said sheepishly, picking up the container. "I'll buy you another soda." "No, that's okay," Paula grinned. It was warm anyway. She held up her copy of Monster Madness and pointed to the cover. The illustration was of a very tall, thin, scaly green beast covered with green, slimy algae. Its skinny arms reached well below its knees. It had left a dripping trail from the lake to the door of a cabin that probably housed unwary human victims. The title read, "The Creature from Luckless Lake." "There are some great stories this month. Isn't this guy the creepiest? It's enough to give me nightmares for a week." Charles rose to his feet. "Nah, my favorite is the alien brain beast. Talk about nightmares." He held the magazine open to a drawing of a hideous bug-eyed creature. Exposed at the top of its enlarged head was a huge, greasy-looking brain laced with blood vessels. Could you imagine coming face to face with this guy on your next trip to Dreamland? Todd laughed nervously. He had been having some unpleasant dreams lately. Although they were unsettling, he had decided not to tell his parents. His mom didn't like him reading things like Monster Madness, and if he told her about the nightmares, she would stop him, for sure. To cover his own uneasiness, Todd chided, "Yeah, and think how scared that brain beast would be if he got a look at you." Giggling, the kids strolled into the drugstore. Todd picked up his own copy of the magazine and counted out exact change at the register. He leafed through it as they walked out into the waning afternoon sunshine. They all lived on the same street, 5 blocks away. Todd wheeled his bike along as they headed home. "So which one do you think is scarier?" Charles asked. "The brain beast or the lake creature?" "I don't think either one is very scary," Todd replied. "I could make up something better than both of them put together." Paula rolled her eyes. "Okay then, what kind of monster would you make up?" Todd thought for a moment, then began to describe his ultimate terror, the creature that had been haunting his dreams lately. "First of all, it would be about my size." "Oh, come on," Charles interrupted. "What's scary about a midget?" He was always good-naturedly kidding Todd about being the shortest boy in class. "Don't laugh," Todd shot back. "Because of its size, the monster can hide in shadows and get very, very close. It could even hide in the shadows of your own bedroom." Charles and Paula looked at each other. The sun was nearing the horizon. The shadows of the trees reached out toward them like long, dark fingers. Its size wouldn't matter, Todd continued, because it would have super strength. It could rip your arm from its socket without any trouble at all. Paula suddenly stopped. She was searching the branches of a low hedge just ahead of them. "Did you see that?" she asked. "No, what?" Charles' voice was a little uneasy. "It was dark and furry, sort of like a big dog or a bear or something." Charles chuckled. "Come on, there are no bears around here." "That's right," Todd chimed in. "There are no bears." He knew he was making his friends nervous, so he made his voice as spooky as possible. "And it probably wasn't a dog either," he said, although he was certain that it was. "It had thick brown fur, didn't it, Paula?" She nodded, his eyes growing wide. "And if you had gotten a better look, you would have seen fiery red eyes and long shining claws." A rustling sound in the bushes made the three walk a little faster. Even Todd was getting anxious now, but he had the full attention of his audience and wasn't about to give it up. "The only thing longer and sharper than the shadow monster's claws are its teeth. Oh, and one other thing. It has a long, rough tongue for stripping meat from bone so that it doesn't leave behind a single scrap." Todd felt particularly pleased with that detail. He had read that lions had rough tongues for such a purpose, and it seemed to work well for his monster. It was certainly effective. Both Paula and Charles grinned uncertainly. "We'd better hurry up," Charles said. "It's getting dark." They covered another block in no time, and Todd waved goodbye to his friends. He jumped on his bike and rode the last half block alone. As the shadows lengthened, he became aware of a strange sound, something like a light tapping or scraping noise. He turned and looked behind him. There was nothing there. Still, he pedaled a little faster toward his house. After dinner that night, Todd did his homework, then got ready for bed. His parents always allowed him to read for a little while in bed, and tonight he used the time to finish 2 of the stories in Monster Madness. When his mom and dad came in to tell him lights out, his mom picked up the magazine and leafed through it. I'm really not sure you should be reading this sort of thing, Todd," she said with concern. "I'm afraid it's going to give you nightmares." His dad came to his rescue. "It's only make-believe," he reassured her. "I used to read this stuff when I was a kid. It's fun." "Yeah, Mom," Todd agreed. "It's just for fun. I really don't believe in any of it." Still, after his parents turned off the lights and closed the door, Todd pulled the covers up to his chin. He scanned the room, trying to see into all of its dark places. Slowly, he drifted off to sleep. In his dream, Todd had just hit a home run and was sliding into home plate when he sensed something strange along the back of his leg. The feeling was odd enough to tug him from sleep back to reality. He wriggled his legs, but the sensation did not stop. Something rough was lightly scraping at the back of his knee. Now wide awake, Todd opened his eyes. He was facing the wall, but he could easily make out the shadow of something leaning over his bed. Turning ever so slightly, he caught a glimpse of the figure. It wasn't very large, but it was powerfully built and covered with thick, dark hair. One furry hand rested lightly on the edge of the bed, and he saw its long claws glinting in the moonlight. To his horror, Todd realized that whatever the thing was, it was licking the back of his leg with its sandpaper-like tongue. Gathering all of his courage, the boy suddenly yanked his leg away and rolled off the opposite side of his bed. The creature raised itself and uttered a chilling cry. He could see its blood-red eyes grow large. The beast began to edge toward the door. "It's trying to cut me off," Todd realized in panic. "I've got to stop it." He picked up his bedside lamp and hurled it at the creature, screaming, "Mom! Dad!" The beast howled and lashed out at him with razor-sharp claws. Todd managed to sidestep the blow as he leapt onto the bed, the beast circling behind him. His path to the door was clear now, but when he tried to jump from the bed, his feet became tangled in the sheets. Todd tumbled to the floor, hitting his head so hard that it made him dizzy. The creature howled. Todd could see saliva dripping from its dagger-like fangs. The terrified boy scrambled to his feet and managed to make it to the hallway and stagger toward his parents' room. He found their door standing open. In the moonlight from the single open window, Todd could distinguish 2 large, still figures in bed, unmoving in blood-stained sheets. He barely noted that there was only 1 window on the far wall where he thought there should be 2. Stunned, Todd leaned against the doorway. "Oh no," he groaned. "This can't be happening." As if in answer, he heard the shuffling sound of the beast as it moved toward him in the darkened hall. It was snuffling and slathering at the mouth. Todd backed slowly into his parents' room. It looked different somehow, not quite as it should be. For a moment, the creature paused in the doorway and looked at the lifeless figures in the bed as if it too recognized them. Moaning lightly, it took an uncertain step toward the bed. Then it raised its lip in a terrible grimace and advanced towards Todd. Horrified, the boy stepped back as far as he could. He found himself pressed up against a dresser, one he couldn't recall being there before. His hand slid across the polished top until he felt something familiar. It was a large sewing basket. A pair of sharp scissors rested beside it, just out of reach. Todd slowly stretched his fingers toward the scissors while keeping his eyes on the beast's crimson pupils. Almost. Suddenly the creature lunged. Knife-like claws extended towards Todd's throat. The boy felt sharp pain. Then something warm and wet began to drip down his neck. In a final effort, he gripped the scissors and stabbed at the monster with all his might, making a deep slice across one of its outstretched paws. The beast roared in anguish, cradling its hand and crying. Within seconds, the room's lights came on, revealing the small, furry creature sitting in bed. Posters of snarling humans stared down from the walls, and books of scary human stories were lined up on the bedside shelf. The beast's worried parents swept into the room. Its mother gently soothed her frightened child. Was it another bad dream, dear? She picked up a magazine that had slipped to the floor beside the bed. A picture of a human with its teeth bared and a pair of needle-sharp scissors in its hand threatened from the cover. The title identified the story, Todd the Terror. She looked accusingly at the large male beast at her side. I told you he shouldn't read that nonsense before bedtime. Then she turned back to her whimpering little monster and started to tuck it back in. There, dear, don't cry. You're all right now. There are no such things as humans. They're only make-believe. I did not see that one coming even a little bit. That was sick. That was so sick. Also, I read really, really fast. I don't usually do this, but I think if that doesn't call for a tip, I don't know what does. Because I was reading so fast, I think I made myself dizzy. Anyway, let's see what you guys are saying. Whew, that was wild. All right. Shane Migliavacca said, maybe you should read Penthouse Forum instead, Todd. That's funny. Keith Tomlin said, sounds like my ex. Michelle Antisocial said, no. Rebecca Randolph said, that was a crazy twist. And Craig Cohen said, in the Twilight Zone. I agree with that, in the Twilight Zone. Keith Tomlin said, humans are the scariest. That was a great one. That's definitely a very Twilight Zone-y ending. I love the idea that, I guess the dreams, my interpretation would be that the dreams were, like a crossing of parallel dimensions, where in one dimension, these monster-type creatures live in the same space as the humans do, and when they dream, sometimes they dream of each other, or at least this boy does. With this monster. But I like that one a lot. There's no such thing as humans. Rachel Rodolphe said, oh man, that was fun. I'm glad you think so. Man. My poor voice. That was not well done. Okay. Hey, that does fix the hoarseness though. Okay. Well, that was a fun one. So I guess, this book is really kicking butt and taking names. So I guess there's no reason to wait other than to tell you, hit share. Tipping is appreciated but not mandatory, but sharing really is very important. Help bring people in to hang out with us for a little while. But we've got another scary story for you. This story is called, What's the Matter with Marvin? Robbie tossed uncomfortably in his bed and drifted towards wakefulness. It was so hot, unbearably hot. Kicking the blankets off his legs, he rolled onto his side, took a deep breath, and began to choke uncontrollably. The room was lit with a flickering, eerie orange glow. The air scalded his throat, and smoke stung his eyes. Mom! Dad! He cried, beating at the red-orange flames licking at the edges of his bedsheets. Mom! He screamed and sat upright. Wide-eyed, Robbie looked around his cool, darkened bedroom. The flames had vanished, but sweat trickled down his neck and soaked the t-shirt that he wore when he slept. Robbie had been only 6 when his parents were killed in a fire that had destroyed their home, a fire that he alone survived. His dream brought back jumbled images of that horrible night. Unlike his nightmare, Robbie had seen no flames that night, just billows of black, choking smoke. He had felt this way slowly and painfully out of his bedroom. Along the hall, down the staircase. Blinded by fumes and tears, he had tried to open the front door, but it was stuck. In a panic, Robbie had used a lamp to shatter a window and crawl from the burning house. That had probably been cause of the short, deep scar that he now carried on the left side of his chest. He didn't really know. All he knew for certain was that he was the only one who had escaped. Robbie ran his fingers over the raised scar. He could hardly remember his parents. The fire had erased everything that might remind him. Pictures, cards, the baseball scrapbook he and his dad had put together. After the tragedy, he lived with his grandparents for 4 years. But recently, they had decided that he needed to be around kids his own age. They sent him to live with his Uncle Lester and cousin Marvin, whom he had met for the first time earlier that day. As he sat up in his bed, he listened to the unfamiliar night sounds of his new home. Outside, a cricket sang in the moonlight, and somewhere down below, a board creaked as the old house settled. And there was something else. A very soft, whining sound was coming from just down the hall. From Marvin's room. Then it abruptly stopped. Robbie leaned back and thought about his day as he waited for sleep to return. Uncle Lester had been really nice. He and Marvin had met Robbie at the train and had taken him to the local diner for the biggest, gooeyest hot fudge sundae in the world. Uncle Lester had watched him eat every bite and seemed to be very pleased. Marvin didn't say much and only had a soft drink. It gave him hiccups, which appeared to worry Uncle Lester a lot. An awful lot. Robbie felt his eyelids growing heavy. Maybe Marvin was just nervous about all the changes. Robbie could certainly understand that. Tomorrow would be his first day at Bridgeport Elementary School. As strange as his cousin was, Robbie was glad that Marvin would be with him. He drifted off to sleep with the slightest smell of phantom smoke still in his nostrils. The next morning, Robbie was very excited as he dressed and hurried downstairs for breakfast. Uncle Lester had prepared toast and scrambled eggs for him, and poured a large glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. Robbie slid into his chair and smiled. "Good morning, Uncle Lester. This looks great, thanks." "Well, you can't get through your first day at school on an empty stomach," Lester smiled, and pointed to a brown paper sack on the kitchen floor. "I've made your lunch, too. Don't forget it when you go." Robbie began to munch a buttery triangle of toast and looked at the sack. "Thanks." The older man held out a small jar of jam towards his nephew. "Here, why don't you try some of this on your toast? It's strawberry." "No thanks, I don't really like strawberry." Lester's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. He looked at the jar in his hand. "You don't like it?" "No, I'm sorry." For a moment, Lester peered right into Robbie's eyes, then placed the jar on the table. "I thought for sure that well, never mind." At the sound of footsteps in the hall, Robbie turned to see Marvin step into the kitchen. "Hey, Marvin, you better sit down and have some breakfast before I finish it all." Marvin glanced at the table, then to the brown bag on the counter. "I'm not hungry," he replied. "I'm leaving now." He opened the screen door and started down the steps, letting the door slam behind him. Robbie gobbled down a last bite of toast and drained his glass of juice. Quickly, he gathered up his notebook and lunch bag. "Wait up, Marvin," he called, then looked over his shoulder and added, "Thanks, Uncle Lester. See you later." Lester stood and moved to the screen door. He waited for several moments watching the two boys. Then he turned and began to clear the table. He picked up the jam jar and held it in his hand, studying it carefully. So, he doesn't like strawberry. A little out of breath, Robbie caught up with Marvin at the bus stop. "Hey, what's the hurry?" Marvin squinted at him as if he were trying to sort something out in his mind. But when the bus pulled up, he boarded without a word, sat in the nearest seat, and opened a book. Robbie sat beside his cousin, and they rode to school in silence. At noon, Robbie found Marvin alone on a playground bench. "Hi, Marv. Did you forget your lunch? My name is Marvin. Robbie sat on the bench. Okay, I'm sorry. Marvin, did you forget your lunch? You can share mine. I don't eat lunch, Marvin snapped and walked away. For a moment, Robbie stared at him. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Don't worry, he's always like that. Robbie looked up and recognized the boy as one of his new classmates. I'm Bill, and I'd be happy to share your lunch. What you got? The two boys checked out the contents of the paper bag and were soon chattering like lifelong friends. In the shadows of a nearby corridor, Marvin gazed at them, stone-faced. After school, Marvin went straight to his room. Uncle Lester helped Robbie with his homework. Then they worked on a jigsaw puzzle together. Robbie became totally absorbed and managed to put the pieces into place one after another. He had the entire picture completed when he realized that Uncle Lester was sitting back, observing him and checking the time on a small stopwatch. Whew, Lester whistled softly. That's the best time yet. Robbie opened his mouth to ask what he meant, then paused. Marvin was standing at the edge of the table. With one hand, he swept the puzzle onto the floor and glared at Lester. Was that fast enough, or maybe it could use further adjustments? Marvin, Uncle Lester sounded very angry. Go to your room. What if I don't want to? What if I just stay right here and we all have a nice little talk, like about family? How about it, cousin? Don't you want to know all about our family? I'd like to tell you, but you see, I can't. I mean, I really can't. If I try, I'll be shut down again. Fists clenched, he turned to gaze bitterly at Lester. You should tell him, he shouldn't have to find out like I did when things start going wrong. But then, this couldn't happen to him, could it? Marvin glared hatefully at Robbie. He's too perfect. Lester raised himself out of his chair. His voice was curiously deep. Marvin, go to your room now. The boy stood defiantly for a moment, then spun around and marched out of the room. Without a word, Uncle Lester followed. A moment later came the sound of a door closing upstairs. Picking up puzzle pieces from the floor, Robbie thought there was something really weird going on here. What was it that Marvin wanted to tell him? What did he mean by shut down? Was he sick? Was he just jealous? Robbie crossed to the fireplace to warm his hands. He looked at the collection of photographs framed on the mantelpiece, then realized that something wasn't quite right. All the pictures of Marvin and Lester seemed to be recent, and there wasn't a single picture of Marvin's mom. She had died a year ago in a car accident just before Uncle Lester moved to Bridgeport. Maybe it was still too difficult for them to see a reminder of her. Maybe that was why there were no photographs. But there were no pictures of Marvin as he was growing up either. Robbie made up his mind. Later, after Uncle Lester was asleep, he was going to talk to Marvin. He was going to find out once and for all what was going on. That night, Robbie tried to stay awake until he was sure that Lester had gone to bed. But sleep crept up on him, and his dream returned. In it, he was lying on the front lawn of his home. He felt the terrible heat from the fire as it consumed everything in his path. He heard the shriek of a siren coming closer and closer. All at once, wide awake, Robbie sat straight up in bed. The sound stopped, but he had heard it. It wasn't a part of his dream. It was a whining noise like the squeal of metal against metal. He strained to listen. Was that something being dragged across the floor? Where was the sound coming from? He slipped out of bed and tiptoed softly into the hall. Now a light tapping noise echoed down the corridor. It was coming from Marvin's room. Robbie crept closer and reached out for the doorknob. He turned it slightly, enough to know if it was locked. Staring at the door, Robbie stepped back, and his bare foot landed right on something small, warm, and soft. The something squealed and raced down the hall. Robbie jumped, lost his balance, and fell against the door. The intruder had only been a frightened mouse. Once the commotion was over, there was no longer any sound coming at all from Marvin's room. Whatever was going on had stopped. He listened at the door, then whispered, "Marvin, can I come in?" Silence. "Marvin, are you okay? I want to talk to you." Only silence. The next day was Saturday. Robbie was surprised when Uncle Lester explained that Marvin had gone to visit a friend in nearby Riverside and would be away for the entire weekend. He claimed that he had driven Marvin over himself earlier that morning. Robbie wasn't convinced, but He didn't ask any questions. Instead, he planned to find answers himself. That night after dinner, Lester wanted to work on a new puzzle. No thanks, Uncle Lester. I kind of have a stomach ache. Robbie watched Uncle Lester's eyes widen, then narrow in disbelief. I thought I might just go to bed a little early. All right, Lester scowled. For a moment he seemed annoyed, then a different expression came over his face. One that frightened Robbie. It was as if he had suddenly made up his mind about something. I suppose it wouldn't hurt for both of us to get some extra rest. Once upstairs, Robbie waited in his bed. High above, a full moon sailed across the night sky. It bathed the room in ghostly light, while dark shadows crouched in the corners and resisted its glow. Once the house was silent, Robbie crawled out of bed and crept soundlessly to the stairs, edging down them carefully, one at a time. The bottom step creaked slightly under his weight. He paused, then continued on until he reached the door to Lester's study. It was ajar, and he slipped in. On the wall above his uncle's desk was a board with several hooks. Single, labeled keys hung from each hook. In the moonlight, Robbie could easily read the tags: front door, shed, pickup, basement. The last two keys were not labeled. He lifted them both from their hooks and headed for the stairs. He carefully avoided the squeaky bottom step and was soon standing in front of Marvin's room. He tried the door, but it was locked. Robbie slid the first of two keys into the lock. It turned and, with a sharp click, the door opened. The room was dreadfully dark and smelled of oil and ash. Robbie had to grope along the wall as he moved inside. He wasn't really sure what he was looking for, but he knew that something was very wrong, and this room held the clue to what that was. Strangely, there was no furniture in his way. Instead, there seemed to be some sort of metal tools hanging from hooks on the walls. When he reached the window, he realized why the room was so dark. Thick boards had been nailed up to keep the light out. His fingers touched a piece of rag that had been jammed in between two boards, and he tugged at it. The rag slipped out, and a sliver of moonlight spilled across the floor. In its dull glow, he could see a table in the center of the room. There was something on it. He walked over and reached out to touch the object. It fell to the ground with a thump and rolled into the ribbon of moonlight. Robbie felt a scream well up in his throat. It was Marvin's head! Suddenly the room was filled with light. Robbie backed up against the wall when he saw Uncle Lester standing in the open doorway with a broad, flat tool in his hand. "I'm really sorry you saw this, boy," Lester growled. "I didn't count on you being so curious. That can be a good thing, but only in moderation. You're supposed to do everything in moderation. Sneaking around the house at night? That's not a good sign. But what's worse is how you lied to me. That's very bad. You didn't have a stomachache tonight." As Lester moved toward him, Robbie edged away. With a slight bump, his shoulder touched something cool and smooth. Hesitantly, he turned and recognized Marvin's headless form propped up against the wall. Electrical wires stood out from the neck like tentacles. He peeked down at the head in the center of the room. Its sightless eyes stared at the ceiling. Wires snaked from its neck. Lester pressed closer. "Yes, Marvin is a robot. When I first made him, he seemed so perfect. I thought of everything. I invented a history for him so that the neighbors wouldn't be curious about where his mother was. Then I programmed it into his memory. No one suspected, not even Marvin, until that day he tripped on the stairs and fell. After that, he never could eat or sleep right. I tried to fix the problem, but it just got worse. When his memory failed and he discovered the truth, well, he was only a prototype. I had always planned to just quietly replace him with a much better model. No one would be the wiser, but now you know far too much." Lester raised the bizarre tool in his hand. Robbie looked around for a way out. "Look, Uncle Lester, I won't see a thing to anyone. I just want to go back to Grandma and Grandpa's." "That's quite impossible, Robbie. You see, you never lived there. I had to provide a suitable background for you, as well, so the neighbors wouldn't suspect anything when you came to live with us." "What are you talking about?" Robbie searched frantically for an escape route. "I lived with my Grandma and Grandpa. They took me in after the fire." Lester smiled and moved closer. "Yes, the fire. The one that supposedly destroyed all of the evidence of your parents. Clever little touch, isn't it? But it was all just a part of your program. Don't worry, with a few minor adjustments and the removal of recent memories, you'll be perfectly all right. You see, Marvin couldn't be repaired. He gripped Robbie by one shoulder and maneuvered the tool to the chest scar. The tool slipped in easily. Robbie felt a strange release of pressure. But then, he wasn't my greatest achievement. Robbie gaped down at the blinking lights in the now open compartment in his chest. You are. Oh, I was starting to get a vibe that Marvin was a robot and maybe Lester was too. But I love that all of his memories were implanted. Woof. Let's see what you kids are saying. Shane Migliavacca said Marvin is going full bad seed. Michelle Antisocial said he's not real. Is he a robot? Shane Migliavacca said this Small Wonder reboot took a dark turn. And then he said, Workshed. I appreciate the reference, my friend. Everybody enjoy that one? I like that one. This book has not been afraid to go sci-fi. So, yeah, definitely not afraid to go sci-fi. So, let's say, yeah, it's like almost 9:30. Let's say we'll do one more. And I do want to mention, don't forget, you can tip if you are so inclined. It is very, very much appreciated. The money is spent on kibble and groceries. And I'm here every Wednesday until I'm not. I plan on doing this for at least another month straight. So come and hang out anytime on my Facebook at 8 o'clock Eastern on Wednesdays and listen to a scary story. So let's get into the final story of the night, my friends. Let's see what more this book beholds for us. Uh-oh. And I'll tell you what, guys. I'm being a little selfish, so I'll tell you what. If we get 4 tips of any amount, I'll read another one after this. But my throat is getting very sore. But that stuff is helping. Anyway, this story, my friends, is called Crying Wolf. Wolfie, you want to howl for us to set the stage? Bark. Bark. Wolfie, can you bark? Oh! Bark. She's just looking at me like I'm stupid. It ain't happening. Wolf. Bark. Wolfie, bark. Yeah, bark. 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 Yeah, there we go. Good girl. That's my good girl. All right. She helps. All right. Crying Wolf. I know you don't believe me, but I'm certain it's true. Annie turned her lower lip down in a pout. Come on, Annie, think about it, Byron soothed. It just isn't possible that the zookeepers are really animals in human form. It doesn't make sense. Byron and Annie were very close friends. They had grown up next door to each other, and he was used to her quirky imagination. Not only did she believe strongly in ghosts, vampires, and werewolves, she often made up sinister explanations for the most innocent events. Since a class trip to the zoo last week, Annie had decided that the zookeepers were really animals that had taken temporary human form. She claimed that the beasts planned to lure unsuspecting youngsters into their lair and then devour them. What makes you so sure they aren't? Annie demanded for the 3rd time. Annie, Byron tried again, didn't everybody come back from the zoo? Is anyone missing? She simply waved her hand and insisted. We were just lucky this time. Byron shook his head as he watched his friend walk away. What kind of story did she cook up this time? John had crept up. And now he playfully punched Byron in the arm. Does she still think the night janitor is a vampire? He curled his fingers in an imitation claws and bared his teeth. No, and don't make fun. She's going to be a great writer someday, and you'll be proud that you knew her. John laughed, but Byron was serious. One of the things that he and Annie shared was a love of science fiction and horror stories. When they were little, they would spend hours reading sci-fi and scary books and magazines. Eventually, Annie began to make up her own stories. She had notebooks full of them, and Byron loved reading each and every one. She had even worked up the courage to send her favorite story to Horror Tales magazine. Byron shrugged. It's just that sometimes She lets her imagination get the best of her. John raised his eyebrows. Right, she's a regular Edgar Allan Poe. Or Edgar Annie Poe. I ruined the joke. She's a regular Edgar Annie Poe. After dinner that evening, Byron gathered up his books and went next door. He and Annie usually did their homework together at a table in the brightly lit kitchen. They were reviewing a list of the state capitals when Annie suddenly looked over her shoulder. "Did you see that?" she asked. Byron looked around. "See what?" "It was something I just saw out of the corner of my eye. It moved." "No, there's nothing." "I saw something," she insisted. "And when you looked, it wasn't there?" "Yes." Byron nodded. "Yeah, I know. Everybody does that sometimes. It's just an optical illusion or something." They returned to their studies, but Byron noticed that Annie kept shifting her gaze from side to side. Uh-oh, he thought. Now what is she going to come up with? It didn't take long for him to find out. The next morning on the bus, she was a little jumpy. "You look tired," he remarked as he slid into the seat next to her. "I am. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Do you remember when I told you I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye? Well, it happened again after you left." "Annie, I told you that everybody sees that. It's nothing to worry about." "No, listen," she gripped his arm. "There really was something there. It was a small, dark shape like a little creature, a gremlin maybe." "You mean you saw a cute little fuzzy, pointy-eared beastie?" Byron teased. "Oh no, we're all in terrible danger." Annie twisted away and looked out the window. "You don't believe me." At lunchtime, Byron and his friends always ate in the shade of the largest tree on the playground. He barely had a chance to open his lunchbox before John started poking around. "Is that ham and cheese?" John craned his neck to see the sandwich that Byron was unwrapping. "If it is, I'll give you my tuna fish." "No thanks." "I'll throw in a bag of potato chips." Annie pulled her lunch from a brown bag. "If you want peanut butter and jelly, I'll trade with you, John." "How do I know it's peanut butter and jelly and not crunchy werewolf tongues and bat's blood?" John put his hand to his throat, crossed his eyes, and did an imitation of choking. The other kids giggled, and Annie looked embarrassed. Byron was quick to come to her aid. "Anything would be better than that cat food you eat every day, John." He winked at Annie. John looked sheepish. "You're right. I can't face another day of tuna fish. I was only joking. Peanut butter sounds great." Annie smiled good-naturedly, and they exchanged sandwiches. John eagerly unwrapped his prize. "What? Are you kidding? Somebody's already been eating this?" He held out the sandwich to show the tiny bites that had been taken all the way around it. "It must have been a mouse or something," Byron ventured on the bus ride home. "A mouse," Annie pointed out, "would not rewrap the sandwich after it had taken a few bites." "It was them! I know who they are. I wrote a story about creatures just like them a while ago. Hungry little beasts from a sort of parallel dimension." She paused as if a thought had suddenly occurred to her. "That must be it," she said. Annie seemed to be talking more to herself than her friend. "I know who they are, and now they have to get rid of me. They're all around, just waiting until the right time. When I'm alone." "Are you still talking about your gremlins?" I told you it's just an optical illusion," Byron said. "But what if it isn't? What if they really are, preying on humans as they please? Perhaps as food, picking us off one by one. People disappear every day." Byron felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Now she was giving him the creeps. "Annie, if that's true, why can't I see them?" "Because you don't believe they're here. You won't let yourself see them. But I did, and now it's too late. I know they're secret. I'm a threat to them, and they have to get rid of me." "You're letting your imagination get the better of you." "Am I? Is this my imagination?" She held out the book report that she had been working on the night before. A faint trail of very small, human-like footprints ran along the side of the page. The next day, Annie showed Byron a large bruise and a scratch on her leg and claimed that they were getting bolder. "I'm really frightened, Byron. They're after me now. I'm afraid that one night they'll come for me and I'll just disappear." "Have you talked to your parents?" "Yes, but they think I'm making it all up," Annie said, almost in tears. "You believe me, don't you? You believe that they're really real?" Byron wasn't sure what to say. He wanted to help his friend. Finally, He whispered, "Yes, I believe you." For a split second, he thought he caught a glimpse of movement nearby. Byron couldn't sleep that night. He was too worried about Annie. Although it was almost midnight, he could see from his window that the light in her room was still on. At last, he pulled on his clothes, quietly opened his bedroom window, and climbed out into the yard. He crept up to Annie's window. He intended to tap on the glass and ask her to come out, but he never got the chance. As he leaned toward the window, he saw the lamp beside her bed crash to the floor in an explosion of glass. When it fell, he thought he saw Annie crouched at the foot of her bed as if she were trying to hide. Her face was twisted in terror, and something else too. 2 or 3 small figures, half human and half beast, lopping toward her on long, thin legs, their clawed hands extended. Maybe, but there just wasn't enough time. Not enough light. A chill ran down his spine. Had one of the little things actually turned and looked directly at him with glittering cat-like eyes? He couldn't be sure. Suddenly, the overhead light blazed. Annie's father entered the room. Her mother stood near the door with her hand on the light switch. Byron crouched down. He watched them scan the bedroom and pick up the broken lamp. He heard them call Annie's name, but she was nowhere to be found. Byron didn't know what to do. He quickly crossed the distance between the 2 houses and slipped into his bedroom window. As he was changing back into his pajamas, the telephone rang. He stepped into the darkened hall and saw his mother through the open door of the family room. She was speaking into the receiver. "No, Angela. Byron is already in bed. She certainly isn't here." She paused as if listening. "I'll talk to him. Then we'll be right over." Byron couldn't decide what to do. He wasn't really sure what had happened in his friend's now empty bedroom. He quickly slipped back to his room and into bed. He could hear his parents' worried voices in the other room. A moment later, and a sliver of brightness shone under his bedroom door. There was a knock, and his mother opened the door. His father stood behind her. Light from the hall spilled into the room and pooled at the foot of Byron's bed. "I'm sorry to wake you, dear, but Mrs. Yates just called. She said that Annie is gone. All of her things are there, but she's missing. Did she say anything to you tonight? Was she upset? Do you have any idea where she might be?" Byron sat up. What could he say? How could he convince them? He knew it sounded crazy, but he said, "Yes, I think she's in trouble. She told me that there were these things like gremlins that were after her." "I don't want to hear that kind of nonsense," Byron's father warned. "We all know about her wild imagination, but this is serious." He looked at his parents. They would never believe it. He wasn't even sure he did, but he had to do something. He threw the covers back and jumped out of bed. "It's not just her imagination. You've got to do something," Byron pleaded. "I looked in her window and I saw them myself. Or at least I think I did." His parents glanced at each other. "They were small and they had claws and sharp teeth. I think they took her away. Maybe they killed her. Don't you believe me?" He looked from one to the other. "You don't believe me!" Byron's father put his arm around his son's shoulder. "How can we?" he reasoned. "I know this upsets you, but you can't start making up monsters to solve your real problems. There's no such thing. This is no time for such things. Annie might have run away. She could be in danger. Now, did she say anything to you that might help?" Byron felt himself go limp. Annie had been really upset. Maybe she really did run away. Maybe he had dreamed the whole thing. "No, Dad. She didn't say anything to me." "All right, we're going next door to see if we can help." "Is there anything I can do?" His mother reached out and stroked his hair. "Not now. Just go back to bed. We'll talk about it in the morning." Byron looked out across the garden and saw his parents entering the house next door. But what if it wasn't a dream? What if Annie had been right? He glanced down, and his gaze fell on something on the sill of his open window. It was a tiny footprint of some sort, something that he had seen once before. Then, just out of the corner of his eye, a slight movement caught his attention. But he turned to find nothing there. Annie is about the coolest character we have ever read on this show. For the record, Annie is just about the coolest character ever on this that we've ever read on the stream. By the way, I don't know. I just want to make that clear. Annie is a boss. Let's see what you guys are saying. David Denoyer said, I have Home Improvement on the TV muted listening to this. Oh my, what an odd experience. It's pretty funny. I do want to take a second to say thank you very much, Jeff McClellan, for your very generous tip that we got on Venmo, and for the note saying sharing great stories. That's what we do here every week. And of course, my friends, I will be back here next Wednesday. We'll continue reading more scary stories for sleepovers, and we'll continue having a good time, and Henwolf will continue sleeping very awkwardly right at my feet and occasionally standing up and blocking my light. But I hope you guys all have a great rest of your night and a great week. I hope you're all happy, healthy, safe, and sane as much as you are into. And thank you guys again. Seriously, thank you. This has been so much fun. Even though today I started out a little bit exasperated because I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off because we had all these technical problems at the beginning. Even so, I had a really good time, and I always look forward to sitting down with you guys. And I will see you all next week. So thank you so much. Have a great night, and I am gonna head out. David Neuer said, "You to bomb, Kuto." Thank you, sir. Rob Field said, "Thank you as always." Thank you, my man. Jeff McClellan said, "Thank you." Thank you, Jeffy. And Craig Cohen said, "Have a good night, Henrik." Thanks. You are so welcome, my friend. Catch you all very, very soon.